Good afternoon, everybody. Hi, welcome to this this session at the Agora sharing stand on home sharing models and their impacts, which is co-organized by the Ajuntament de Barcelona, Dimons Research Group of the Open University of Catalonia, and the Noutur Research Group, which is another research group in tourism and leisure, also at the Open University. My name is Julie Wilson. I'm a researcher and professor at the Open University. And I'm here to moderate this conversation today about home sharing models and platforms and their impacts. So we're just waiting for a couple of speakers to arrive, so I'll start introducing this session, if I may. Thanks all for being here. I recognize it's lunchtime, so either skip lunch, bring your sandwich, great, come along, and we'll get through this together somehow, okay? So we're here to ask today, how the sharing economy, the collaborative economy, the platform economy have become mainstays of the tourism sector, of the tourism industry. And tourism has traditionally been framed as an industry, and governments have commonly responded with a different range of more likely than not neoliberal policy measures aimed at disrupting equality. And Juliet Shaw, I don't know if any of you saw her talk on Monday, mentioned this. And one thing that hasn't come across too heavily now, up until now, has been the impact that these platforms have on local places and spaces. And there are obviously growing concerns about the different impacts that might result from these activities. At their worst, we're talking environmental impacts, resource depletion, climate change, and everything else, but more locally. As Juliet Shaw also asked on Monday, we can ask whether inequality is disrupted really by these platforms, or whether it's actually intensified in favor of already privileged residents of cities in terms of class and race. So basically, it's within this ideological space that the collaborative economy has gained momentum in tourism. So we need to ask in this session, can home sharing platforms and the whole range of them between more cooperativist sharing models to the more extractivist peer-to-peer models, can they contribute anything in terms of achieving more long-lasting sustainable tourism outcomes? We have a nice panel lined up for you today. I'll introduce them in one moment. We want to talk about the contradictions and the opportunities that arise from the existence of these platforms. Look at how we can get more sustainable and more equitable alternatives to traditional models. So in the Noutur Research Group at the Open University, we're working on two different projects in this area, one of which is funded by the Spanish Ministry of Economy and Competitiveness, entitled Collaborative Economy and Tourism Spaces, Contributions, Transformations, and Challenges. And I think you can find some information on this project on the coffee table here, on the stand over there. And a second project, which is an interdisciplinary project with researchers from the Open University, from 4 different faculties, that looking at social movements' response to collaborative economy platforms in the context of the city of Barcelona. There's also a leaflet available on this project if you'd like to pick one up. And I'd just like to... On the 12th of December, we have an event at the Espai Francesca Bonmaison in Barcelona here to debate the different aspects of the relationship between social protest and resistance movements and the platform economy in the context of tourism. So you're warmly invited to join us on the 12th. So today's session, I'd like to invite the panelists. We're still missing one person, but if the 4 of you could perhaps come and sit down. Thank you very much for being here. I'd like to thank also the Sharing Cities Summit and the Dimons Research Group for organizing this session. So perhaps we could go along the line and introduce ourselves here. First, we've got Murray, if I'm not mistaken.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Murray Cox. I'm the founder of Inside Airbnb. I collect data on Airbnb, and I release it publicly. I track 100 different cities around the world, and I've got tools for you to analyze how Airbnb is used in a city.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Pete Byrne. I am from the government of the city and county of San Francisco, and I work for our Office of Short-Term Rentals, responsible for implementing short-term rental regulations in San Francisco.
I am Sito Veracruz. I am one of the co-founders of FairBnB Co-op. We are a social-oriented alternative vacation rental platform.
Hello, I am Emmanuel Mounier, the Secretary General of the European Technology and Travel Services Association. So it's an association representing most of the short-term rental booking platforms you know, but not Airbnb. So I would like to specify it right now as I'm speaking right after Inside Airbnb and FairBnB. I would not be able to speak for Airbnb here. Thank you.
My name is Kenneth, Haar. I work with a group called Corporate Europe Observatory. It's a lobby watchdog based in Brussels. And that would make someone ask, what on earth am I doing here? I think I'll get a chance somewhere along in the program to explain. I've been monitoring Airbnb lobbyists in Brussels for a while now.
Okay, thanks a lot. Welcome, everybody. Thanks. Nice to see we have the full lineup in place. We're very grateful for the collaboration of a collaborative pad, which I think is being run from over here, by La Teixidora, which is a great output from this session. So thanks very much for your collaboration. And as I understand, if you have the link, you can actually contribute to this process and feed into the notes that are being taken out of this session. So the questions we've brought into the panel today, the session is designed more as a conversation than a presentation panel. So, and in line with the fact that we have a collaborative pad being undertaken here, we've decided to organize it around, firstly, the weaknesses and threats of the larger, more extractivist accommodation platforms. And then shift the conversation towards the opportunities and strengths that this represents as well. So I'd like to kick off with the first question. To ask the panel, to what extent are home sharing platforms, in all their different senses along the whole spectrum of possibilities, to what extent are they genuinely all about sharing in the initial sense and grounded in the principles of more sustainable business? Or to what extent are they extensions of more traditional capitalist business models in tourism, masquerading in some cases as socially and environmentally sustainable alternatives via the rhetoric and narratives they use? Who would like to kick off with that? Perhaps Peter or Murray?
Where do you want to go first? All right. So I'll speak more in the context of my area of expertise, which is probably looking at American cities. And we find that when you're looking at kind of more extractivist platform models versus potentially more cooperativist or kind of, I think that as it was poised in the question, the true kind of heart of sharing in its original context, we find that platforms kind of run on a 20-80, 80-20 context. And what I mean by that is that while a large majority of potential hosts are sharing maybe a room or only part-time in a kind of genuine transaction potentially, the data points that the other 20% are making up actually 80% of the business. So there's two truths there, right? And the first being that many hosts, I think, on all platforms are trying to adhere to the model. However, the minority of hosts, that 20%, are making up about 80% of the total business on any given platform. And those numbers can diverge slightly, but that trend holds true, I find, in cities that I've looked at.
I would just add to that. So there is a broad spectrum of possible platforms that you could be talking about. But if we're talking about home sharing, Airbnb is by far the biggest player. It's capitalized at $31 billion. It's got 5 million listings available around the world. Via my data, it shows that in almost every city, the most popular listing is an entire home. And so when we talk about extractive platforms, they're not just financially extracting, they're extracting housing from the housing market. And so I think that's an important point to remember in terms of the negative effects that these platforms are having as they convert living residential cities into hotels.
Yeah, I would also like to add something that I think was very interesting from the talk by Juliette on Monday as well. That was that in the case of home sharing platforms, the impact goes beyond, of course, the users that are using the platforms, are the neighbors. So I think that we forgot at the beginning of the conceptualization of sharing economy to include to what extent the impact could be a positive economic impact, and of course a nuisance and a negative impact in the neighbors, and that is a bit what we are trying to do in the part of what we are trying to do in FairBnB.
Thank you. Well, I just wanted to say that indeed, in the document you will see for the ETTSA, you will not see home sharing or sharing economy. We are using a much more, I would say, business vocabulary, short-term rental, because indeed it's quite an old business model. Short-term rental has been existing for about ever. Well, B&B, bed and breakfast are something existing in the UK for ages, so it's not a new phenomenon. What is new is a scale that was brought by the platform economy. Basically, before you had property managers renting their properties to tourists, for example, in some seaside resort not very far from here. And with the platform economy, the entry barriers were lowered considerably, and it allowed some normal citizens like you and me to get into this economy. So it's quite normal that we have quite a lot of property managers in this business, because well, they were there before actually. What is new is to have citizens in this business, and the scaling up of this economy is what is new and what we have to deal with now. It's not really the platform as such; it's the scaling up of the short-term rental business. Thank you.
Well, perhaps just a short remark on, because the first two speakers may sound as if they were speaking only for the US. I'd say they're not. The picture is pretty much the same in European cities. And just to advertise a bit, I think Murray has done an excellent work on statistics. And on his website, insideairbnb.org.com, he may even have a list. He even may have stats on your city, though you live in Europe. And from that, if you look closely and work a bit on the methodology, you will see that, I mean, as far as Airbnb is concerned in particular, and it is the biggest player, the scene in Europe is practically the same.
Okay. Anybody else want to come back on that one? Some very interesting answers. To carry on from that question, in relation to the image of home sharing platforms, we know that certain platforms, particularly Airbnb, are highly adept at selling narratives that capture place identities to be able to sell directly neighborhoods for what they're worth. And this kind of language can be difficult to resist, particularly for certain social groups. What kind of opportunities are there for counteracting this effect? These kind of smoke screening effects of the kind of negative impacts that the platforms can have on real world processes and places that neighborhoods consist of. Anybody want to add anything to that?
Just to voice what some of those messages are that you hear from platforms like Airbnb: live like a local, make a few extra dollars. Airbnb has a budget of $100 million on communication per year, of which $85 million of that is lobbying. So it's not just happening at the consumer level in the media, it's happening behind closed doors. But I think that there is a combat to that. There is a way to resist that via information, via academic researchers coming out with the truth. The media is involved with that. I think cities have really understood what the real impacts are. Some of them are doing education campaigns. And so I think that I think where most of us have learned not to believe corporates, well, most of us, but I think that many of the consumers still look at what the consumer service is, and services like Airbnb are really convenient. And so thinking about sustainable tourism, that might be a way that we could make people think more about the impact that Airbnb is having at home, but also away.
I think that, of course, these narratives are extremely important, effective, but there is another narrative that is growing, that is growing a lot within this sustainability, sustainable tourism, we're realizing that there is a part that is the social sustainability. 20 years ago, we started thinking about how our impact when we were traveling from one place to the other in terms of how much were we polluting. And now people is realizing that the way they are, the accommodation they are choosing in a city can also have an effect in the neighborhood they are visiting. And this is something that was not happening 10 years ago. So it is something new, and it's something that, of course, is going to grow. So I think that will counteract quite much these marketing narratives within these realities.
Yes, just maybe to pick up on what Murray said on the communication spending of Airbnb, I think you have to make a difference between marketing, so the narrative is very much marketing, what lures the consumer into going on the Airbnb.com to book for short-term rental rather than another one, or rather than on FairBnB. It's really marketing, it's business. And then you have lobbying, which is another thing, I think another issue. Kenneth will be happy to talk about it, I guess, which is, well, what is the adequate regulatory framework for short-term rental in Europe or in the States? That's different discussions. And, well, happening behind closed doors, I don't know, I'm right here today, so I'm happy to discuss with you. So let's have a discussion in the open. But what is new, and you're very right in saying so, Sito, is the scale of those activities and the impact it does have on the neighborhood. So with this new phenomenon, we need some new regulation. And yes, indeed, the booking platforms, the short-term rental platforms, try to have a voice into this conversation on what will be an adequate regulatory framework. And there is, well, I can speak only for Europe because that's the only thing I'm dealing with, but we are having this discussion with the European Commission, with the member states, with the local authorities, and that's also why I'm here today. We think that indeed we need an adequate regulatory framework. We think that indeed at local level, with some housing issues, with some impact on the urban environment, some local regulation may be needed in certain cases. But we need to talk about what will be the right regulatory framework, and that's why we're here today. I'd just like to mention very quickly, if you look at our website, you'll see that we have adopted my association and also another one called the European Holiday Home Association, a roadmap for the sector, where we are just basically making us available to discuss with any local authority on what will be the adequate regulatory framework. So should we set up capping system? Should we set up some registration schemes? Well, everything in the open, as long as it's complying with EU law, obviously. But there is a discussion we all need to have, indeed, because there is an impact, there is need to look at what is the adequate regulation.
Thanks very much. Okay, so the question of social sustainability came out there in Sito's comment. I'd like to ask you your opinion of how do these impacts vary between urban contexts and rural contexts? Are we talking about the same kind of dynamics? Are we talking about the same kind of negative impacts? Are these impacts more visible in rural areas? And we're increasingly seeing from Airbnb's statistical databases that the rural context is more important than we thought, perhaps. Anybody have any ideas on those differences?
I would say that in my experience at regulating on the behalf of a city, in the beginning I was expecting to see this more as a urban context, particularly as it related to growing affordability issues within most urban centers. And I was really taken aback within about the first few months of starting our office at how many phone calls that we were inbounding from rural jurisdictions. So increasingly what would happen was neighborhood groups or members of commissions to rural communities would be calling us saying, we have these issues. We actually have no place. So a lot of second home communities, like where people would spend time in maybe wine country in California or in ski towns in Colorado or Catalina Island off the coast of Los Angeles, where people would often go vacation for a weekend, and there was a need for housing for service workers. And that short-term rentals had begun affecting that market severely, where local business owners were actually having trouble finding lodgings for their service workers because so much of the housing had been effectively converted into short-term rentals. And so while this issue, I think, is, and I believe similar things may be happening in Palma de Mallorca and a few other local European areas, although that is obviously not my area of expertise. I think we just need to recognize that while in rural contexts people maybe are gaining access to areas they otherwise may not have, It also has the same impact on housing and can be quite more acute given the small amount of housing available in rural areas.
Yes, maybe to continue on the same idea. Indeed, the impact can be very different, and you can have an impact on housing shortage at the local level, and with the need to address those shortages. You can also have some other situations where actually short-term rental is providing an answer to a lack of accommodation for tourists, and so it can be a leverage for local development as well. So there are all kinds of different situations, and I think it's quite important to look at every situation on a case-by-case basis, to determine, and basically what I'm saying is just not some kind of advice. If you look at EU law, it's saying quite clearly, and there is an EU Commission paper detailing this legal framework, that if you were to limit, to restrict the access to the market to short-term rental, you need to look at a fair justification. Is there really a shortage on the housing market? Is there really a causal link between the short-term rental platforms and such a shortage? Quite often, or the ones who are calling you, I think, are the hotels, the local hotels, saying, well, we're not happy. So, and so basically they are calling for a ban on short-term rental because, well, they're considering it as unfair competition. That's another question, and we are happy to discuss it as well. And then you need to adopt some proportionate answers. But the answer have to be defined on a case-by-case basis according to the situation. I think it's not, the right way to look at it is not from the platform angle, but more from what is the local situation. Because some communities could be happy to have more opportunities offered thanks to those platforms, with the new opportunities offered by the platform economy.
So I agree that we should be looking at cities on a case-by-case basis. But what we hear from entities like the European Commission, the lobbying being done at the European Commission is that by the industry, is that they don't believe, the industry does not believe that cities should be able to make their own decisions to regulate this activity to protect housing. And so there's been some documents, and I think, Kenneth, you can talk about that later. So I think that's a very important point, that cities should be able to decide their future, their vision for the future, whether it involves tourism or not. I think in regional areas, there may be cities that are being abandoned just as a process of the economy and moving to larger cities. The University of Sydney in Australia has done a study of coastal councils in Australia, and they've found, so you might find that there's a smaller number of short-term rental listings in regional and coastal areas, but as a percentage of housing, they can sometimes be quite large. There's one area in Australia called Byrne, 1 in 8 houses are vacation rentals in a place that people want to live as well. And so I think it's vitally important that we use data to understand the issue, but we also allow the cities to make their own decisions.
Well, perhaps I can a remark on what's going on in the European Union at the moment then. It is, and particularly in Brussels, particularly in the offices of the European Commission, what is going on at the moment is a process that was initiated by lobbyists from Airbnb and the other big platforms, and it's mainly about one thing, and one thing only. It's about restricting the options of cities when they start regulating these platforms. In Brussels, the Commission is very concerned with the wave of regulation that we've seen. There are restrictions in Barcelona on the number of permits. In Berlin, you cannot change an apartment from a regular rental apartment to an apartment for tourists. And there are many, many other examples. In Brussels, that is conceived as a problem. It is conceived as a problem that cities are starting to act in a way that, in the minds of the Commission, goes against European law. So that, perhaps we can get back to that later. I noticed that at the very end there's something about the European Union. But, I mean, I'm the bringer of bad news from Brussels. At the moment, that's where things stand. It's about restricting the options of local authorities when they regulate short-term rental accommodation platforms.
Well, thank you very much, Kenneth, to grant me so much power on being able to force the Commission to adopt such restrictive views. But I'm afraid that basically how the Commission sees itself and its role according to the treaty is to be the guardian of EU law. And if you look at the EU treaties, at the EU regulations, and those ones are all pre-existing the emergence of platforms. So Airbnb was not even existing then. It provides for quite a clear framework on what you can do when it comes to restrict the market access at local level. So, well, this interpretation of EU law is a Commission interpretation, and I'm not sure that Airbnb or any platform has anything to do with that. If you read the treaties, it's quite clear, and those treaties have been adopted even before I was born, actually.
You decide. Are we going to
At the end of the day, here there is a power clash in the way we interpret the laws, and in the sense which sectors are we looking closer. So, of course, here in Spain, also the competence regulator, they are saying that there are too many regulations, and they are actually attacking cities and regions that are trying to regulate too much, because housing regular norms should be a competence in a state level. But of course, housing and tourism are in a local level. So I think so many times we are forgetting that what is happening in the cities is of course something to be regulated for cities thinking in the neighbors. And companies and the rights of the companies to operate should of course be put after the rights of the citizens.
Yeah, I agree. Murray, would you like to add to that?
Sure. I mean, Kenneth pointed out some fears with the European Commission, but there is hope. For example, on Monday, a group of cities met at a Sharing Cities conference. These were, and one of the principles that they all supported was the ability of cities to be able to decide their future. There's actually a task force from the cities that involves going to the European Commission and lobbying for this, for the member states. And there's strong support for this to not allow corporates, and the main arguments that the corporates have, these platforms, is that they are solely intermediaries. They're just like a bulletin board. They're not actually involved in impact on the ground. They're not benefiting from this impact. And so I think it's important to know that the cities are gathering together in Europe, and they're fighting the right to decide their destiny, especially as it relates to housing.
Last comment from Kenneth? Well, I think we can come back to the topic of regulation towards the end. I'd like to just change the emphasis a little bit. When you do research in this area, particularly, but in general, I think there's a kind of overrepresentation in some respects of the mega platforms like Airbnb, and less attention is paid to the non-monetized or alternative forms of platform, which come from a different position altogether. We have a video. We weren't able to have any participation from the homeexchange.com platform today, but I understand they've sent a video in, so I'd just like to, even at the risk of breaking the conversation slightly, put that video on for a moment. Well, let's carry on with the next question related to this. I wanted to introduce the dimension of non-monetized platforms, but perhaps we can just carry on with starting to talk about alternative home sharing models and their potential to counteract the impacts that we see in the context of the larger extractivist platforms. Initiatives such as FairBnB, we have Sito with us today, which is fantastic. I'd be interested in knowing what kind of models of democratic governance do these platforms use, and what kind of social environmental values are they based on? Okay, well, we can have the video as an example of a non-monetized platform. And then we'll carry on with that question.
So let me present you very briefly who we are and what we do. Home Exchange is basically a platform that allows thousands of users, actually 450,000 users in the world are using our services to exchange their homes during the vacation. It's a very affordable and flexible way to travel that allows either reciprocal exchanges, typically you stay in my home while I stay in yours, or non-reciprocal exchanges, which are a lot more flexible and give a lot more opportunities to our users. So why is home exchange fundamentally different from rental? The main difference is that there is no money changing hands between our users. Typically, home exchange is free. There are only some very, very limited service fees that just help us to maintain a user-friendly and safe platform for our users. But there is no speculation because obviously there is no money to earn. The second reason why home exchange and rental platform are very different is more cultural. Every host is a guest and every guest is a host, meaning that every person who is going to stay in your home is equally someone who is going to welcome people in their place. And that changes completely the relationship between our members. Another reason why home exchange is not like rental is that the cultural immersion is really at the core of the concept. When you travel with home exchange, of course there are a lot of homes in central cities, but you can also stay in rural area, in suburban areas, because what people are looking for typically is authentic places. They want to have a cultural immersion, they want to have an experience of what it is to live in the area of Barcelona and not necessarily in the center of the city. So this is typically the population that uses home exchange, and this is a cultural dimension that we are really fostering among our members the most we can. The impact on the environment is very limited because typically these homes are empty during the vacation. People go, homes are empty. So it's just a way to maximize underused homes that are empty the rest of the time if they are not home exchanged. To conclude, home exchange is a highly accessible and democratic way to travel. 50% of our demographics are families. They are really the main beneficiaries of this concept. We receive countless testimonials of parents saying that without home exchange, they would never have had the occasion to do the international travel they do with their kids. I hope I have answered some of our questions. Thank you again for your invitation.
Okay.
Hello.
Well, unfortunately, we can't address any questions to the home exchange platform, but I'm glad we had a chance to look at that video as an example of a non-monetized platform. And there are many other forms as well. We have couch surfing, one of the earlier models. So perhaps we could start with asking Sito to explain a little bit about FairBnB as a potential alternative model platform.
Yeah, well, FairBnB, we are a project that started 2 years ago, and actually we started by merging different projects that were facing this idea of how could a platform, a vacation rental platform, be fair. So with this initial idea, which are the, how can we face this? And we were actually doing it from different paths, and I was more, because of my background, I studied law and urban planning, so I was more in a regulatory side, while other people was more thinking about the impact in neighbors and about how to involve them. And in the end, we integrated these visions, because in the end, there are several visions that we think that need to be challenged. And well, our main differences with other platforms, first of all, is from a regulatory perspective, we have a one host, one home policy as a general rule. And we are, of course, complying with local regulation, but also supporting cities to shape their own regulation, and also even open to be more restrictive than the current cities. As for instance, in Venice, where the regulation was really loose, we just want to operate with the residents that are renting their place, because in Venice, of course, there are a lot of external or foreign investors historically. The second biggest difference is that we want to invest part of our profits in community projects in the area where the reservation is done, as a way also to spread the profit of this activity and try to make the neighborhood part of this profit of this economic activity. But actually, we go further with our third biggest difference is that we are a cooperative. And right now we're a workers cooperative, but we aim to become a multi-stakeholders cooperative, involving in the management and in the work, in the profit of our activity as a company, also neighbors, hosts, and residents. Because the idea, as I was mentioning, in the end, of course, home vacation rental enlarges inequalities, because if you don't have a house, you cannot rent a house. So our idea is, how can we involve neighbors in the management in the way that they can shape how these policies are better done, but also providing services for hosts and guests that, in a way that they are also part of the business. And that is, so this is our main vision.
Okay, yeah, that's a fantastic initiative, really. And I think I had another question lined up to ask you about any examples you might know of where home sharing platforms are obliged or incentivized to contribute long-term to neighborhood maintenance costs, to community support mechanisms, and surely it's in the interest of platforms to help underpin these values in local neighborhoods. Does anybody else have any examples of initiatives that have, because I think FairBnB is pretty unique in this context. It's gone a lot further than any other platform has gone in terms of relations with local places, I think.
Yeah, and I think there are other platforms will have more resources than us to donate money to other projects. We'll have better technology also to make like the co-hosting initiatives to involve neighbors as property managers. But I think that the focus shouldn't be that much the donation, but rather the solidarity. So how to work with local initiatives, and again, not being the neighbors, treating the neighbors as additional police, but as part of the management and policy making of the policies in a local and in a corporate way.
Anybody else like to contribute to that, or any other alternatives apart from FairBnB, or whether we're really talking about the initiative as being at the vanguard of all of this? I think we are, right? So, well, let's move on to the next question in that case. Shifting the focus again slightly to the topic of alliances that have, see whether there are any examples of formal or informal alliances that have managed to take on the global extractivist platform lobbies and have actually managed to bring about real change via their activism. Does anybody have any examples of this kind of initiative?
Go. Sorry about that. I think, informal and formal alliances exist on a multitude of levels. And I'll kind of break down 3 quick examples of the different levels that we see. So I think probably first and foremost, at least when one sets about the task of regulating this, there's a lot of questions that cities have to begin to answer and skills they have to build. I think one of them kind of one of the key alliances that San Francisco's undertake is actually work with data providers such as inside Airbnb to garner data to measure, gauge, and implement regulations as necessary. And that's pretty standard. But I would also say that the cities have done, in San Francisco in particular, is we've actually gone out and wrote friend of court briefings for the city of Santa Monica in support of regulations that they're taking and that are being challenged in court by vacation rental platforms currently. And we also advise other cities that approach us with regards to how we've approached the problem when they first begin to set out to do it. So there's that formal, both in-court briefing and informal. And those are probably two key examples. The third, which is probably most important, is on the ground and doesn't really involve the city. And that would be groups and stakeholders in given cities with various different, maybe opposing viewpoints on a host of issues. They find an umbrella with regards to their approach to short-term rentals, and they then come together with this shared approach to cities and advocate for change. So namely in the example of San Francisco, uniquely what happened was we had tenant activists and small-time landlords both concerned with the impact of short-term rentals, lobbying the city and their various different camps and bringing them to force or to ask for change from the council, which prompted them to legislate. So I think you see it at all different levels, and it's a unique issue in that it brings together a lot of different causes for same concern.
Regarding alliances, what we are seeing from people that approaches us is that I think, and I was about to mention it before, in rural areas, I think that we are going to see them more. And using vacation rental and using all type of accommodations, teaming up with other services, other institutions, formal and informal groups in the area, like making tourism destinations in rural areas. We find that as something that is growing. I think that people are realizing that they can also use the power of platforms to make their area better. And well, in this case, I think makes total sense, and it will be this micro OTA as future.
Maybe to pick up on the first action mentioned by Peter, I was mentioning earlier this industry roadmap that we've adopted with another European association. The very first commitment we took in this roadmap was to make ourselves available with the local authorities to look at the data together. We indeed have some data. Murray managed to make the Airbnb data more clearer to everybody, available to everybody. Well, we do have some data, and we are fully available to talk with local authorities to look at the data together to assess exactly what is the issues, what are the issues, what is the situation, and what could be done to deal with it. Indeed, the first thing I have to do, with every time you face a problem, is to assess the situation in the most objective way possible, and we have some tools to do that. So we are happy to help.
Well, just a quick comment on that. Some platforms may be happy to help. Most are not, particularly the big ones. Airbnb is involved in a struggle over data, and they're clinging on to a European regulation that apparently allows them not to work closely with authorities on data. So there's another bias at the European level. About the local alliances, what I see, perhaps particularly in Northern Europe, I'm not sure, no, in the South as well, that, I mean, often you will see that those pushing for regulation of platforms would be those directly affected, and that would typically groups of tenants. It would be housing activists of various sorts, people who really see negative impacts on their neighborhood that will be deepened and made worse if local authorities don't step in. Normally, that would be where the whole process starts. After that, there will be other alliances you could discuss, but I mean that would be the main dynamic.
Yeah, and on the question of who's impacted most, they're usually at a local level. They sometimes have power in their local council. They have a lot less power at the regional level. They have no power at the national or the European level in the case of Europe. And so that's where there's a power imbalance. It's important to mention the hotel industry. Sometimes it's equated as a battle between short-term rentals versus hotels. I think that's a false equivalency because short-term rentals are using housing, and so it's a multiple markets that are being impacted, not just the hospitality industry, it's the housing markets. But the hotels are lobbying at the regional levels, usually to protect their commercial interests, so it's important to note that is happening. I act as an analog hub between, I connect cities together, I connect activists together. Yesterday I met with ABTS, which is a local assemblea of associations in Barcelona. And we talked about the situation in Venice and other cities and about connecting together to have a visibility of the resistance and coordination of this issue and sharing resources. And so that's another movement, not just on the short-term rental issue, but on touristification. In many European cities, they're suffering from a scale of tourism that is not sustainable. And so it requires regulation. On the subject of data, I think that's one of the hotly contested issues. Corporates obviously should have a right to protect their data, and consumers should have a right to protect their privacy. But the feedback that we're getting from cities is that's usually a negotiation point with platforms' data. I don't believe it should be a negotiation point because that negotiations are really left up to chance in terms of negotiating data, that we should be building that into law. Or in the case of San Francisco, there is data that's being transferred, but usually it's about data around registrations or a permit number where that's required, and platforms are only allowed to list listings that have the required permits from the city. So that removes any negotiation from the situation, and the regulations are allowed to work as they're designed by the city.
Thanks, Murray. I think the data issue is obviously quite a current one here. I think I saw a tweet on Monday from inside Airbnb, either yourself or a colleague, I guess, that had been at the meetup of the Sharing Cities Summit with the local governments. And I think it was a representative from Vienna that had said either, there has to be an obligation for accommodation platforms to share data or to come to an agreement with the city. And in the context of Vienna, I think there was a mention of 5 platforms having failed to do either of these things. So we have seen this in the local context. The regulatory dimension is starting to shift, with cities starting to put enough pressure on the major platforms to start sharing data and come to an agreement with particular city authorities. The final question for the panel today is in the line of how you see the issue of regulation developing in the future, and how can we talk about regulation considering the entire spectrum of policy instruments and tools currently available. And in the last instance, what role might supranational organizations play in the regulation of such platforms, for example, the European Union? Perhaps we can open that up to all participants, and then we'll sum up.
Oh, there it is. Well, the first question was about what tools would be available, and I think, they're being discovered at the moment. Oh, okay, let me. There's a lot being tried out at the moment, and cities are finding the formula that helps their purpose. I'd say there's a waiver regulation, which main intention is to protect the stock of apartments that can be rented out to locals at a reasonable price. And among the examples are, you can put a maximum number of days that can be rented out to tourists. There are neighborhoods that perhaps need limits on the amount of flats available for tourists. In some cities like my own, for someone to rent out a flat, they actually have to live there. It's been pretty effective in protecting Copenhagen against some of the effects that you see in other cities. And there could be many more. But I cannot help but ending on about the European Union. I mean, let's hope that in the future the European Union would have access to affordable housing and protection of valuable city environments as a slogan, as their main objective. That is not the case at the moment. All the policies that I've just mentioned is being questioned repeatedly by the Commission, and at the moment there is an investigation going on at the request of a lobby group. The investigation is into whether Barcelona, Paris, Brussels, and Berlin, if what is going on vis-à-vis regulation of platforms is actually in breach of EU law. If they find that it is, and if there is not sufficient action by the government and the local authorities, then the issue will be taken to the European Court of Justice. So that's the state of affairs at the EU level. Let's hope we can change that in the future. There is, I think Murray mentioned that as well, there is a process going on where cities unite to have an impact at the EU level, and I hope, I'm sure that somewhere along the lines the Commission will be forced to take a step back.
Thank you. Well, on the tools available, I think that the different tools you mentioned are quite interesting. Capping systems, limitation of number of nights. Well, one of the big problems we face as platforms is to find a way to identify the traders, the one having multiple properties and listing all of them on our platforms, and the non-traders, the individuals just renting their place for a limited number of nights a year. It's quite difficult to find some objective criteria or some, let's say, uniform criteria all over Europe. Is it me? So we will welcome actually some guidance from the Commission on how we should identify trader and non-traders and what kind of different regimes we should apply to each category. This is something on which we are very much asking for more regulation. It is a real issue because indeed there is no. You were saying that in your business model there could be one home for each member. So basically you cannot list several properties. Well, indeed there are very good reasons to treat differently individuals and businesses. So we agree with that. We just want to find a fair way to distinguish between the two categories, and it's not that obvious, honestly. Then on the European Union, well, the fact that there is an investigation is quite reassuring. It means that some people are looking at the situation. I think before being able to say that some mean lobbies pushed in one direction, we need to look at what will be the decision. Until now, I didn't hear about any decisions which were negative for cities. So, well, if someone had to complain about some lobbying done by some stakeholders, maybe it should be us, because, well, in the situation, in the current situation, there was no firm action by the Commission on any side. They're just looking at the situation. So, well, they're looking at the situation. We are having a conversation with them. We're happy to have a conversation with all the stakeholders, with the local authorities as well, because yes, once again, we absolutely acknowledge that some issues can be raised with the development of those platforms, and that we need to look at those situations together to find sustainable solutions. So that's our objective.
Well, I see the future of regulation. I am quite optimistic about the future in regulatory terms. I think that what has happened in these initial years is just crazy. It's just the beginning of some activity that we were not expecting, and eventually things happen as something that I think is normal. There was not the activity, but now understand. I think we can. It's quite normal to find people that don't understand that accommodation should be treated as another activity within zonification of the city, within urban planning. We cannot imagine allowing offices everywhere or restaurants. In the same way, we cannot allow accommodation everywhere, and we have to, obviously, to check it in a proper way. I am optimistic because I think there will be more data-driven decisions. I think what Mounier has done with Inside Airbnb has been amazing, but that should be done in a more open way, easy access way, and funded by citizens, by us, so by public institutions, because it is in our interest. All the regulation is in our interest because we are the citizens, and of course, companies can support, but it's on us. And finally, I think, of course, there will be, I think that real-time occupation models will be also interesting to apply, to see, because also when we talk about the, let's say, the most innovative regulations, as in Amsterdam and San Francisco, the 90 days, it is okay, but it's not the final path at all. I mean, we can still find buildings that are still plenty of, that are, the 100% are accommodations for one night. And we should, eventually, I mean, it happens in Amsterdam, and we should try, I mean, I think we also are facing challenges and new opportunities in the future, in that sense that being even more smart and in the way we apply the regulation, we make them.
So I think what we're seeing with regards to regulation and the trend and evolution of terms of regulation, much better. I think we're seeing kind of 3 phases. And the initial phase is an outright ban where it's illegal, but there's no real kind of check and balance going on. And I think we've kind of all lived through that wave. And that's what brings a lot of us here. And so there's either an outright ban or it's kind of allowed and there's no enforcement. I think the second wave, which we're seeing a lot of cities go through and set, is that they're trying to set requirements. So I think you mentioned Copenhagen has a residency requirement. San Francisco has a residency requirement. And the third, which is probably one of the most important, is that they're looking at the mechanism in which you then go about enforcing those requirements. And that debate, I think, is coming around, and I think it's been echoed here about data transparency. Or what we have in San Francisco, which I think Murray mentioned, which is platform liability, where platforms are required to validate a license with the city before they're allowed to have any bookings transacted. Now, I think the other major thing that kind of hovers over this that's been talked about a lot here is that there's a lot of preemption happening at supranational levels or regional levels. And I'd say that that's also happening in San Francisco. Both that is occurring at state levels. We see some talk of that in New York, although I think that's subsided. Tennessee, Florida, Nebraska, Arizona. So it's not just limited to kind of cities with large, states with large cities as well. And usually that preemption is occurring with the lobbying of the platforms, looking to supplant local city sovereignty. And I think the second thing you have to see, and from personal experience, is that absent that state preemption, what we're also noticing is a lot of legal action occurring where we were sued by HomeAway and Airbnb to preempt our law around liability. Santa Monica was sued as well, and it's expected that further legal action, I think New York is in the midst of a process as well, and so it's expected a lot further legal action on top of that. Kind of state and regional preemption will continue to be a trend while people move their way through the development cycle.
Okay. So I think each city needs to decide their own regulations, but looking at the impact, so how are these platforms being used or abused? And what's the impact? The impact that I care most about is on housing. And so from that point of view, in cities that have housing pressure, how are vacant houses being promoted and instead of either by investors and then converted into short-term rentals to actually reward that type of behavior, or people buying up or renting properties. And so not renting to residents, but renting to tourists instead. And so I think it's important for every city to have their own policy, which might be either permissive or restrictive. I think the major tools that are being used are yearly caps, permit systems, but any type of regulation is not going to work unless you can enforce the regulation and ensure compliance. Many cities have tried permits and caps, but they usually get low compliance because there's no cooperation from the platforms, because they're basically pushing the liability for the legality onto the hosts. And so even in Barcelona, thousands of hosts have been fined between 30 and 60,000 euros for breaking the law that the platform that Airbnb has been promoting their use even though there's no more permits available in Barcelona for entire home rentals. So I think that's important. On the subject of one home, one host, again, every city needs to decide whether that law is for them, but from my point of view, there's the same impact on the city whether you have one host with 20,000 homes or 20,000 hosts with one home. The impact is 20,000 homes lost to the market. And so it shouldn't be a focus on who's renting and who's benefiting, although that's important from an equity point of view, but what's the impact and how do we limit the impact?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm afraid we've run out of time. I'd like to thank all the panelists for their contributions. Very grateful. Thanks for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for those following on streaming, and we'll hand over to the next session. Bye.